we all know Krauss. I asked him a question. I don't know if he remembers this, he probably doesn't, but I asked him a question at the Imagine No Religion conference, like, why do you do this? From my perspective, it was tireless. You're literally all over the world all the time, and you don't have to be. And it's just in him to do it. I don't think he, like a lot of us, he can't not talk about it. And I'm really looking forward to hearing science and militant atheism. Without further ado, Lawrence Krauss.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. I thought you were going to say that I can't stop talking, which is what a lot of people say. But anyway, I'm going to try a lot of different things, because I got a sense from when I was in Imagine No Religion and also even down in Denver recently that there were going to be a lot of people who might come to this, and I don't like giving the same talk twice if I can help it. And so I wanted to do something completely different, which I'm doing. First with the music, you notice it was from Hair, if those of you are old enough to know that. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that in fact, it's relevant. I've recently become good friends with Eric Idle, and who I'm texting right after this to tell him about the blasphemy thing. If he doesn't know it, he'll like that. But I told him that I play the Galaxy song a lot, and I've never really given him royalties for that. And so we decided I would take a break. And at the same time, I wanted to give, I got asked to give a talk that was somewhat different. In fact, Spencer really bothered me because he asked for a title, which I hate to do because then I have to think about what I was going to talk about. And so I gave him a title because I thought I was thinking at the time I was going to be writing an article for New York Times called Why I'm a Militant Atheist. And I thought, well, great, I'll write this article for the New York Times, be a breeze, I'll give a talk on it. And then other things came up, so I didn't write it, and then I was sort of cursing him the last few days. And then I noticed I'm listed not as giving a talk. Because if I was giving a talk, I could just give a lecture, but I'm supposed to give a keynote. And so I figured keynote addresses get partly read. So I'm going to do something unusual because I was just writing it, in fact, on the way up here and today, and read some of it. But I can't do that without giving a lecture on science too. So at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about science too. So there's something to look forward to at the end of all this. But I wanted to. Today's really been an interesting day for setting up what I'm talking about. So the title of that New York Times piece, which will get done at some point, is Why I'm a Militant Atheist. This is on science and militant atheism, as you can see there. And I'm often accused of being a militant atheist. Sometimes a fundamentalist too, but more often a militant atheist. Whatever. That phrase, as I hope all of you realize, is completely ridiculous. And it's a label created by those who want to marginalize and attack those of us who, for the most part, simply don't want to be hypocrites. Or we don't want to accept the proposition that there are certain notions that have to be legislated to be off limits, simply because they're built to be ridiculed. And I spend most of my time trying to do science, and when I write or speak about science, I do it because I want to help people enjoy and encourage them to learn about the remarkable things that have happened in our understanding of the universe, which are truly exceptional in the last few centuries. And that I get great pleasure from. It is not just part of our cultural heritage, it is our cultural heritage, and it saddens me and sickens me that it isn't shared more broadly. But at the same time, I get attacked by a lot of my colleagues who are scientists, deeply attacked. And they ask me why I bother, when I write a book like The Universe of Nothing, to dilute the message by reflecting on the fact that the developments that have taken place in the last century also make the absurdity of religious beliefs quite explicit. And they argue, look, should we risk alienating all these people who are already anti-science? At the time, there's already too much fear of science and antagonism towards science. Should we risk alienating these people by ridiculing them? Shouldn't we better just shut up? Especially if we shut up, can't we build a common ground with religious groups towards the goal of creating a better, more equitable world? So what I don't want to discuss tonight vigorously is why the answer to these questions is absolutely not. And I think I've been set up well today for that. But I want to begin with two facts, and I'll begin like Laura. These facts are not in dispute. The word sacred is profane, especially when it comes to science. The very idea that some concept or idea is beyond question, beyond attack, and beyond ridicule when necessary is an anathema to the scientific method. It's the opposite of what science is all about. Good. It's great. Yeah, applaud as much as you want because there's very little content, so we'll need to fill in the time. But second, another fact. Like it or not, science is an atheistic enterprise, no matter what you say. And this was really stated really well by a biologist in 1934, a very distinguished biologist, J.B.S. Haldane, who wrote, "My practice as a scientist is atheistic. That is to say, when I set up an experiment, I assume that no God, angel, or devil is going to interfere with its course, and this assumption has been justified by such success as I've achieved in my professional career." He wasn't stating an opinion, he was stating a fact. He then stated an opinion that he inferred from that fact. He said, "I should therefore be intellectually dishonest if I were not also atheistic in the affairs of the world." That was 1934, and I wonder if he was attacked as much as Richard and I are for making such a logical assertion. I think he probably wasn't. This notion that scientists can't ridicule religion is relatively recent, I think, based on a fear that I want to talk about, an unfounded fear. But before I get there, I want to make it clear, all of this makes it sound like scientists are as fixated on this potentially harmonious relationship between science and religion as the theologians are required to be. But in fact, nothing could be further than the truth. They just don't care. In more than 30 years as a practicing physicist, I've not once have I ever heard the issue or the issue about God, even the word God, mentioned at a scientific meeting. It's just irrelevant. Quite simply, belief or non-belief in God is irrelevant to our understanding of the workings of nature. So if that's the case, why bother talking about it if you're a scientist? Why bother talking about it in public? The first place, I think the scientists who berate me are hypocrites, or at least being hypocritical. Because privately, they always confirm to me that their scientific understanding of the universe is incompatible with the real doctrines of the world's religions. They're also atheists, okay? So they immediately argue that I shouldn't talk about that in public, but privately, they all agree with me that, of course, it's incompatible with the world's religions. Second, it's an empirical fact, and I like empirical facts. In fact, they're the only kind of facts. It's redundant. That science does draw people away from religion. It does. To deny that is to deny reality. And to do that, you just have to look at not only the number of scientists, but take the National Academy of Sciences, which is supposed to be the elite organization, the elite club. Over 90% of those people are not religious. I mean, what is amazing is that 10% of them are. But, like it or not, the more we learn about the workings of the universe, the more we realize that it has no purpose. To suggest otherwise is simply a lie. Scientists have an obligation not to lie about the natural world. If they suggest harmony with the world's religious doctrines, directly or indirectly by silence, they are aiding and abetting that lie, in my opinion. In doing this, especially by adopting silence for fear of offending others, it seems to me they do more to aid those who want to distort science than do people like me who openly offend those people. Now, what also surprises me at this particular focus on offense is rather peculiar. For example, take any other topic. Take climate change, for example. By speaking out about the reality of climate change, one certainly in my country, one of my two countries, as some of you know, I'm also Canadian, but which someone was asking me today if it undoubtedly affected my worldview since it was my formative years. But by speaking out about the reality of climate change, one risks alienating many Republicans who, to be sure, already view science with distrust. So by talking about the reality of climate change, you're automatically alienating those people who view science with distrust. Would the scientists who argue that you shouldn't talk about the ridiculousness of religion also say we shouldn't speak out openly against or even ridicule the ideological rigidity of those who blindly claim that climate change is a myth permeated by liberal scientists? Those scientists wouldn't say that. They say we have to talk about human-induced climate change, regardless of the fact that it undoubtedly alienates Republicans and others who view scientists with suspicion. Somehow it doesn't bother them in that case. Let's take a more current example that's upsetting me right now, and that's when I tend to write. Planned Parenthood. Every single Republican candidate in the United States called for defunding Planned Parenthood. The lawmakers are right now talking about calling for a government shutdown, a shutdown of the federal government unless federal funds for Planned Parenthood and other family planning programs are stripped from spending bills for the fiscal year starting October 1st. On Friday, Arkansas became the 5th state to try to cut off state money by ending its contract with Planned Parenthood for services to residents covered by Medicaid, which is the health insurance program for poor people in the United States. It's run jointly by the states and the federal government. So they want to cut off funds for services to poor people in an effort to defund Planned Parenthood. They're the 5th state. It follows Louisiana, Alabama, Utah, and New Hampshire, almost Canada. So what services does Planned Parenthood provide that are so loathsome? Well, it provides services mostly for low-income clientele for contraception, wellness care, cancer screening, and the diagnosis and treatment of sexually transmitted diseases for women and men. Horrible. That's not why they want to defund them. It also provides fetal tissue from abortions for use by researchers who can hope to use the tissue for research into curing diseases from Alzheimer's to cancer. Storing and safeguarding those tissues so they can be used by researchers costs money and resources, and Planned Parenthood charges those researchers the cost of storing those tissues. Now, it's clear that many who are protesting Planned Parenthood right now are also individuals who, for one reason or another, are anti-science. Should scientists clam up at the risk of further offending or alienating these people from science? Or should we speak out loudly to point out the following empirical facts? Redundancy again. A, in the absence of providing those tissues for researchers, those tissues would be thrown out. B, instead what Planned Parenthood is doing is providing this material for research to possibly save lives, or at least improve the quality of people's lives. Should we not, instead of clamming up, loudly point out and ask the question, do these same people object to organ donations? Because it's basically the same thing. Now again, I would argue that most scientists would suggest that we should point out that the fetal research is important, independent of the fact that it's going to alienate people from science. But somehow, religion is different. Let's talk about another subject that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is child abuse. Not abusing, I'm not thinking about, but anyway. Who couldn't be opposed to child abuse? But of course, many Christian scientists refuse to allow their children access to medical care, as you may know, instead having them prayed for. 12-year-old Ashley King, 2-year-old Robin Twitchwell, 7-year-old Amy Hernanson all died in the last few years because their parents refused medical care. Originally, their parents were convicted of murder and child abuse. In every one of those cases, the convictions were overturned for religious reasons by higher courts. And I think I have some slides, because I can't give a talk without slides. So this is kind of interesting. In the healthcare law, what's now Obamacare, Owen Hatch, or actually it should be Orrin Hatch, whoever wrote that made a mistake, is a Republican from Utah, senator, added an amendment to the Senate's healthcare reform that would have required insurers to reimburse charges for religious and spiritual healthcare, which was to support the idea that prayer instead of doctors. Representative John Shimkus sponsored a similar amendment to the House's healthcare bill. It turns out campaigns by the following groups: the American Humane Society, Child Incorporated, the American Professional Society on Abuse of Children, Every Child Matters, only one, well, we'll get to this, only one actually professional scientific academy, the American Academy of Pediatrics, Freedom from Religion Foundation, American Atheist, Secular Coalition for America, and the Americans United for Separation of Church and State were successful. The amendments were not included in the bill, thanks to these people. According to an article in the San Jose Mercury News, the Christian Science Church said it blamed the removal of its prayer fee mandate, but this was all because the Christian Science Church had money and were lobbying Congress. They blamed the removal of its prayer fee mandate on vehement and often misleading opposition voiced by a longtime critic of Christian Science, as well as a coalition of atheist groups opposed to the notion of anything religious in law. Great. This should be celebrated, but it's tragic. Why the atheists? Why not the scientists? Congratulations to the AAP, to the American Academy of Pediatrics, but it's the only scientific organization that spoke out against this. The only people to speak out against it were the atheists, the atheist groups. Why? The same kind of fear of offending religious institutions. And it's disgusting to me. The National Academy of Sciences, the American Association of the Advancement of Sciences, all sorts of groups that in one way or another I'm associated with should have spoken out. Praying is not an acceptable form of medical care. Empirically, it's not an issue. Offense or no offense, we need to openly attack that belief as nonsense. So, speaking of offense, which is really what's driving a lot of the reason scientists oppose certain people speaking out and ridiculing religion, is the problem is when we hesitate to risk offense for simply questioning something, then questioning becomes socially taboo. I can't stress that enough. Questioning itself becomes socially taboo. I want to give you an example of this, and it's from ESPN, which I don't watch very often. But so this was an amazing news story that hit ESPN, and I'll show you the first few minutes of it, so make sure the sound is up there. Let's see if we got it.
Sure, Arian Foster is a star running back, but he's now being called the first active pro athlete to stand up for secular Americans. Foster is speaking out for the first time about why he doesn't believe in God. ESPN The Magazine senior writer Tim Cute wrote the story, joins us now over the phone. Tim, Foster grew up Muslim, read the Quran and the Bible. Why doesn't he believe in God?
Well, Kerry, I think there's a complicated answer to that question, and a lot of it has to do with the way Arian was brought up. He was brought up Muslim, but he was brought up in a very free-thinking family where they encouraged their kids to sort of take different looks at things. And Arian always had sort of a scientific bent. I think that he told me that he always looked at things and looked at this idea of a higher power through sort of a skeptical lens. And a lot of it was that he didn't quite understand the way that people used God to inject into everyday life, and then to use a modern example is the way that, players say that God helped them win the game. And it didn't ever work with him. And so he did read the Quran, he did read the Bible, and he did that as sort of research to try to find his own truth, as he puts it. And I think that's really where it started. And he avoids using the word atheist because he says he has an open mind, and he may change his mind someday. He may come around to the idea that he was wrong. So it's not.
Okay, it goes on. You get the tone? It's news, first of all. Why is it news? If he'd come out as a Christian, it wouldn't have been news. But secondly, you notice there was something wrong with him. If he read the Quran, he tried to find the truth. Why, if he read those, does he not believe in God? Yeah, exactly. Because he read them, that's right. But he may see that he's wrong. That was the point. He may give him time. He's got an open mind. He'll come around. What I didn't want to go on because these sports writers are really obnoxious. But the next point is, is he ostracized by the fellow players? And of course, the answer is yes. And we have to change that. The very fact that this is news, and for some reason, someone coming out and saying, you know what, I got questions, seems kind of crazy to me, is an issue that it's all due to the fact that questioning has become socially taboo. And if scientists don't lead the questioning, then who is going to lead the questioning? That's my argument. So the particularly legal sanctioning of the legal sanctioning of ideology has become enshrined in something called religious freedom lately. This is, of course, become the equivalent of the freedom to restrict other people's rights. The argument is made that religion provides a legally sanctioned way to condemn and restrict other people's beliefs, lifestyles, or biology, because it's religious freedom. Now, I had another clip I was going to show you, and the sound wasn't great. And also, I had to start a lot late, and I'm really, most of you want to drink like I do, so I'm not going to show it. I think it's also it's Ted Cruz, and I just can't stand listening to him. But you'll be pleased to know you should look at it. It just came out. This actress, who many of you may know, named Ellen Page, who was in Juno, which I probably was filmed in Canada. Probably is she Canadian? Yeah, of course. She questioned him in Iowa while he was at the pork convention there, and literally, and of course about this question about gay. She's come out recently as being gay, about laws that want to restrict gay and lesbian lifestyles and LGBT lifestyles, and allow employers to not hire people, etc. And she was questioning about this, and what he talked about was the persecution of religious people. And the example he gave was that these people who he said owned a church, which was pretty neat, and they were asked by that performed weddings, and they asked by a gay couple to not perform the weddings. To perform the weddings, they refused, of course, based on their profound religious beliefs, and they were taken to court and eventually had to pay $5,000, and their church closed down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, this is an example of the persecution of religious people because they refuse to respect other people's rights to do what they want. Well, the interesting thing is, it's not a church, okay? It's an art gallery. It was a former church, which they bought and converted to an art gallery, flower shop, and bistro. Okay, and that they performed weddings there. So the idea is, shouldn't they be therefore allowed to not perform weddings for a gay couple? And I want to point out that the answer is they should not be allowed to do that. Because religious freedom, at least in the United States, has come to mean having ridiculous beliefs shielded from attack by the social contract. So if you have ridiculous beliefs, you have to be shielded legally from attack by the conventional social contract that we all have. This is misguided. First, belief is different than action. Okay? You're allowed to believe whatever you want. Okay? But actions are subject to secular law. We live in a secular society. And so we restrict actions, we don't restrict beliefs. Beliefs are shielded because we substitute respect for the individual's beliefs, which is what we should be having. I mean, you can respect that they have beliefs, you can think the beliefs are ridiculous, but you can respect the individual. So we respect the individual's beliefs, we substitute the respect for the individual's beliefs with respect for the beliefs themselves. So we should respect an individual's right to be stupid, okay? But that's not the same as respecting the beliefs. And what we've done is make that substitution. And that's vicious and insidious. Religious freedom does not allow individuals providing secular services to the public to refuse services to blacks, for example. Surely we're not militant if we protest openly someone whose religious beliefs allows them to refuse a service to black people, as used to happen in the United States in particular. If the argument is given that blacks are inferior, scientists should surely not risk offense to those people by pointing out that science discredits that worldview. That's not militant. That's an obligation. Let me give you a personal example. As some of you know, I participated, unfortunately, I do a lot of things, some of them I regret, but I participated in a debate in London a while ago. You've probably seen it on YouTube, some of you, and on Islam versus atheism. It was a very scary event. I walked out at one point because it was segregated. Yes, thank you. And that got recorded for, everyone has cameras now, and it got recorded and became a big deal. But anyway, but what happened, which was the scariest part, was the last questioner, who you can see in the video, was a woman, a Muslim woman who was in a bag, and she was offended deeply by the fact that I had forced desegregation on her. And what I said to her, and I said, look, I can respect your beliefs that you're uncomfortable being around men. But if you are, you shouldn't come to this. This is at a university. This was at a university, a public university, which, by the way, anyway, it doesn't matter. I was going to tell you, some good things happened as a result of all this, but it was at a public university. I said to her, this will be on the internet, stay home. Okay? You're entitled to feel uncomfortable or that it disrespects your religious beliefs to sit near a man, but you live in a secular society. And this is a secular institution. If you come here, just like you would go to a soccer game, you cannot expect people to cater to your religious whims. Moreover, if you wanted, you could have moved. The obligation is upon you if you are uncomfortable. But in a secular society, we have to live by the rules of secular law. Those are secular laws applied to actions. So your beliefs are not to be respected necessarily. Or your beliefs internally should be respected, but the actions you take on those beliefs, if they're secular actions, need not be respected. In fact, we can legislate against them. Okay. Now, the next thing that really hits home with me in particular, and it's only hit home in the last 10 years since I've been doing this in one form or another, and I've come much closer and to respect many things about Richard Dawkins that I disagreed with before, and hopefully it works both ways. But we need more than ever at the present time to ridicule stupid ideas. Because if we don't, then people in rural Arkansas or downtown Kitchener will be, I don't want to equate those two, but I haven't spent a lot of time in downtown Kitchener, so I have spent a lot of time in rural Arkansas. But they'll be subject to the tyranny of the moral majority. And that tyranny is particularly loathsome. I want to return to child abuse. Children need the example that education provides them precisely so that they can question their faith. Okay? They need that. Science provides a potential liberation for those children. Should we worry more about offending religious bigots than liberating children from the grinding weight of guilt and enforced ignorance? To me, I can't express how important that is. It's really personal since I've been doing this. At 2 o'clock this morning, which is when I had begun to prepare this talk, I got the following email. Oops. Okay, let's go back. Okay, Dr. Krauss, my name is so-and-so, and I'm a student currently attending my sophomore year at so-and-so. I just wanted to send you an email and let you know that you, along with Richard Dawkins, inspire me to leave my Christian worldview behind and pursue science. I'm sure you've heard this story many times, and I have, but I think it's worth repeating. But I grew up in a small Christian town and graduated in a class of 44 students and never felt that anything other than Christianity was a possible truth. Because of you and Richard Dawkins, I found inspiration in my life, and I can finally live a life without the constant fear of burning in hell after I die. Pursuing this knowledge also helped me escape a depression I suffered from in high school. So more than anything else, I want to thank you. You're doing great things, and you've helped me a lot in my life. Thank you. But it's not self-serving. It's self-serving to show it, but the point is I hadn't appreciated the real reason we need to do this. It's letters like this. I get a lot of them, and they're poignant. I was crying when I read that. I received an email from a 27-year-old man who's now studying in the United States after growing up in Saudi Arabia. His father was executed by family members after converting to Christianity. He says that it's learning about science that has finally liberated him from the specter of religious fundamentalism. Here's another quote from another email I got recently. I felt isolated and damaged because of the reaction of my family and friends to my rejection of religion and my love of science. Here's another one. You have helped me understand that I'm not the only one to have these thoughts. And that's what's most important. These emails and lots of others that come to me and Richard, and we see them every day. This is the major reason, it seems to me, to speak out publicly with ridicule. It's not to criticize the nonsense associated with religious doctrine for its own sake, or to try to change the minds of those committed to those beliefs. It's to demonstrate to young people that it's okay to question. It's okay. They shouldn't feel guilty. They shouldn't feel bad. They shouldn't feel like they're bad people. We should use science to help instead of hiding science to be safe. That's really the reason to do this. It's not just to attack the committed, who can't be changed. It's for the young people who are in a society where we feel it is so inappropriate to ask questions that if they start to ask questions, they both feel guilty and alone. And people like me who have a public voice have to make them not feel alone. When we have the Reason Rally, or we show the unbelievers, which happily has had a huge impact in that regard, young people see that they're not alone. And that is the essential reason we have to remove the stigma of ridicule, and why it's more important to offend some people who may be anti-science than it is to adhere to this fake respect for nonsensical beliefs. Okay. I have to give a quote from Richard Feynman. And Feynman, I'm a big fan of his, in case you didn't know, he said, permit us to question, to doubt, that's all, and not to be sure. It's our responsibility to proclaim the value of this freedom, to teach how doubt is not to be feared, but welcomed and discussed, and to demand this freedom as our duty to all coming generations. Science at its basis encourages open expressions of doubt. And progress often occurs by disproving the accepted wisdom of the previous generation. It seems inconsistent to have no problem ridiculing the claims of astrology, for example, which all scientists do, even though a significant fraction of the public believes these claims, while arguing that to suggest that various religious tenets are equally poorly founded in reality hurts the cause of science. So why is it okay to ridicule astrology and not Christianity? Now, I don't think we should demean individuals. Well, some individuals we should demean. But we shouldn't shy away from publicly accepting that many of the specific claims of the world's major religions are simply not true. Brian talked a little bit about this. Well, you don't have to turn to the contradictions in cosmology that I might talk about in my book. After all, many of the books, the holy books were written, as Bill Martin, I've said, before people knew that the earth went around the sun. There are many simpler falsehoods, from the existence of domesticated camels at the time of Abraham, which we know didn't exist, to Muhammad's famous night journey to a mosque in Jerusalem, in spite of the fact that there were no mosques in Jerusalem at the time. Empirical facts, that's all you have to deal with. To the fact, which I didn't know if Brian would mention, but which I tried to publish in the New York Times in the election when Romney was running for president, and they refused to do. To the fact that Mormonism is not just stupid, all the religions are stupid. But it's just empirically wrong. I mean, all the stuff in the Bible is clearly nonsense about Jonah and the whale, but you can say, okay, well, it happened then, no one saw it, big deal. But one of the central holy books of the Mormon faith is an Egyptian papyrus translated into the book of Abraham, one of the central bits of the Mormon religion. Well, unfortunately, they translated a year before the Rosetta Stone. The year before the Rosetta Stone was translated by a physicist, among others, I'm pleased to say. And we now know exactly what it said. In fact, they actually found the papyrus that the Mormon church was based on, so they couldn't even hide it. And we now know exactly that it was the burial rites of Ra, how to put the oil in and all this stuff. Nothing to do with that. So one of the central books of the Mormon religion, we just know it's garbage. I tried to get that in a major U.S. paper, and I couldn't get it in. Now, there may be many places in the world where you would risk decapitation or lashing, as we've heard, for questioning some of these claims. But in a rational world, it's hard to argue that openly questioning or ridiculing these or a host of others that are equally dubious should be viewed as inappropriate. Education at its heart is inseparable from teaching doubt. We owe it to children who encourage doubt. I described it as when I got a recent award at the American Humanist Association. And I've often said that imposing religion on children is child abuse. It's not the same level as denying medical care that causes them to die, but imposing beliefs on children before they are capable of questioning them is abusive. We heard about this from Carolyn Hippolyte a little bit, and I should say that it's really abusive. One thing that she didn't mention, which I learned from my late friend Christopher Hitchens, if you read this wonderful book on Mother Teresa, which you should, it's called Missionary Position. Mother Teresa is supposed to care for poor children. What a disgusting woman she really was. And one of the things she did was she believed that the suffering on earth would make them better in heaven. So the poor children in her hospitals weren't allowed pain medication, because the more they suffered, the happier they would be in heaven. Exactly. And she also talked about how few prisoners are atheists this morning, or this afternoon. No, this afternoon, because I, too, also thought the meeting was in the other hotel and missed it. But I get lots of letters from people, and one of my favorite letters, which I had in my door for a long time, was from I get a lot of letters from prisoners. And I got this great letter from a prisoner who said, you know, I'm in prison, it's given me a lot of time to read, and so I read your books, and I'm an atheist, and there aren't many atheists here. Most people are Christians. The most devout Christians are the child molesters. Okay. Also consider this. I'm going to skip this thing about, well, yeah. I mean, there's a study that shows if you teach children, you know, religion, they can't distinguish between fact and fiction as well as others. And I was going to quote it, but I don't think it's a very good study. What I want to suggest is that some psychologists do a better study. This was done by people at School of Education, so the methodology isn't particularly good. But there is evidence that's claimed to be the case that we already really do a disservice to children by force-feeding them these stories when they're younger, that they have a harder time distinguishing fact from fiction. Okay, but so much for the obligation to fight nonsense. What about the other issue? Again, worrying about offense. I'm emboldened by an acquaintance of mine, who some of you may know of, called Stephen Fry, who I admire for many reasons. He's a wonderful man. Actually, he impressed me maybe most. We were both privileged to be asked to speak at Christopher Hitchens' memorial service, and Stephen during the ceremony reminded us of a quote from Hitchens, who said, "The four most overrated things in life are champagne, lobster, anal sex, and picnics." Stephen Fry said he agreed with 3 of those things. Anyway, so you know I like him. But he's pointed out that confronted with someone, he's offended. He says, "So I hear I've offended you." Big fucking deal. Okay? Offense is owned by the people who are offended. They can choose how to act in response. They can ignore it. They can offer intelligent counter-arguments, or they can cut your head off. The first 2 are responses of a civilized human being. The last of a barbarian. Equal a religious barbarian, because that's the only time it happens. The point I want to make is that this worry about giving offense has become so ingrained in our society, we should worry about it. This is an example that utterly disgusts me, and it's a newspaper I write for periodically, the New York Times. On the front page of the New York Times, there was this picture a few months ago when, as you may know, Charlie Hebdo headquarters was attacked by Islamic terrorists, and they killed everyone. This was a guard outside who'd been wounded. Not anyone drawing the cartoons, but a guard who'd been outside the thing. And here he is begging for his life moments before they shot him in the head, okay? Okay, this was on the cover of the New York Times. A week later, Charlie Hebdo produced a newspaper, okay, here, which I have many copies of, I'm proud to say. You know, this is Canada, so everything's pardoned. I'm Charlie. Okay. The New York Times would not publish the cover. They had a front page article about the cover, but they wouldn't publish the picture for fear of offense. Now, this picture offends me much more. Okay? And associated with this worry about giving offense is a worry about giving offense to authority figures who are in a position to help us if they so desire. The greatest virtue of science, it seems to me, it's such a great virtue that I gave my daughter when she was 1 year old a T-shirt, which she's obeyed ever since, at least when it comes to me. It's called Question Authority. And questioning authority is what science is all about. There are no scientific authorities. And to worry about giving offense to authorities is really, in my mind, the most insidious of all. When it imposes a kind of self-censorship, if you view the church as an authority, it's the greatest danger of all. For example, the Pope recently came out, as you probably know, with an encyclical about climate change. And I wrote 2 pieces about it. And people got upset with me because I criticized the Pope. This guy's a friendly guy, right? He's a nice, fine, kindly, compared to Benedict, everyone looks that way. But of course, he's not. He says the same garbage, the exact same garbage all the time. He's absolutely no better. In my mind, he's worse because he gives the appearance of being nice, okay? And I'll take, thanks. My wife has told me to get rid of that picture. Thank you. So he came up, so he said, okay, climate change is a bad thing, but one of the things he specifically said in there is that family planning is not the solution. Population control is not the solution to the world we live in because, and so what I pointed out is that that's garbage. And we have to be willing to point out the garbage when the Pope says it, because if we don't, we give respect to ridiculous ideas. And the very fact that he's coming out and saying something useful, that climate change is a problem, but arguing, of course, that individuals have to have it in their hearts to change the capitalist economy, and also that family planning is not a problem, that the population of the earth is not a problem, God will take care of that, is disgusting. And we have to be willing to point that out. We have to be willing because otherwise, if we let authority figures try and censor information, we end up with something like this. Not like this, but like this. Okay? This was an article in the New York Times last week, which I'm fully aware of because I get asked all the time. You have this guy. Yeah, you do. Temporarily. Yeah, well, 9.5 years, ladies and gentlemen, 9.5 years you put up with him. And he is, as you know, silent scientist, government scientist talking about things like climate change, because he comes from Alberta. And whenever we allow that, whenever we allow that kind of censorship, that kind of open restrictions on questioning and pointing out inconvenient truths, then we have a problem. If we don't speak out against governments like Stephen Harper's, in societies with freedoms such as we have here tonight, for fear of offending, then what message does that send to places like Saudi Arabia? How can we help this guy here? Or, I mean, again, last night I was reading the New York Times, and there's an article. It's an article, an op-ed piece in the New York Times about a young guy who from Iraq, basically, he couldn't finish his college exams because of a video he'd seen about 2 men being killed, their necks noosed, their bodies dragged through the streets and set on fire because they were gay just like him. And he managed to escape Iraq. We've seen people being thrown off buildings for being gay. But I think of all of this as a slippery slope. There's a connection between, in free societies, being afraid to offend people for ridiculous religious ideas and the right of people in other authoritarian societies to kill people because of them. It's a slippery slope. When we accept nonsense with any sort of impunity in our society, we do it a disservice to ourselves and, most importantly, to our children. If science has done anything, it's to liberate humanity from the shackles of superstition and enforced ignorance. It's happening in the end. It's not militant to celebrate this openly, to combat a conspiracy of silence and acquiescence, to make questioning everything so normal and so accepted that young people will not feel guilty for doing that, that TV hosts will not have news stories when someone does it, will not accept governments, totalitarian, theocratic, or democratic, that endorse, encourage, or enforce, or otherwise legitimize the suppression of free thought. We owe it to our children, not just here, but around the world. We owe it to the media to point out that self-censorship destroys a free press, the basis of a modern democracy. We owe it to all people around the world. And scientists have an obligation to be a part of that. That's the end of the diatribe. Now I'm going to give you a little science lecture. Okay. It hits a sore point with me, in case you hadn't realized it. When I get told that as a scientist, I do a disservice to science to speak out about, to point out that what we've learned about the universe makes us realize that certain things that people are told are ridiculous. And obviously, I've got attacked a lot for the book of The Universe from Nothing, which, by the way, has maybe a page or two, maybe 3 at most, that talks about God. But I'm told throughout the whole book is scattered tirades about religion, and that demeans the science. It doesn't, because the science tells us that the universe could be created from nothing without any supernatural shenanigans. That's worth celebrating, okay? I want to just tell you, I owe Spencer, even though he didn't tell me that the thing was here today and I was sitting at the hotel. I want to give you a tidbit. This is the only speaking engagement I've agreed to do in this 5-month period, because I'm trying to finish a book, which I'll finish next month. I'm almost there. So I want to give you a little tidbit from the new book. The book, by the way, is called The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far. Okay? So this is appropriate in Canada to have icicles on a window. Okay? This is something you could see. It's beautiful. And we can look at it from outside and see what it really looks like. But what I want to point out is, if you lived on one of these icicles, the world would look very different to you. If you lived on one of these icicles, everything would be different. For example, if you lived on this icicle here, this direction would be different than all other directions. The forces you experience in one direction will be different than the directions perpendicular to that direction, because you're on the spine of that crystal lattice. And if you grew up in that universe, that icicle universe, that direction would be very special. You might create a religion to explain why that direction is very special. But it would govern everything you see about the world. And in fact, it's a scam. The real world is hidden underneath that. It's an illusion that is special. What we've discovered in the last 50 years, which is in part what my recent book is about, which is really about answering the question, why are we here? The other question asks, why is there something rather than nothing? This is about why we're here. And the answer is, there's no reason. Okay? But what we've discovered about the fundamental picture of the universe is that the universe we live in is exactly like living on that icicle. And I don't mean just approximately, but exactly. The world we see around us is an illusion created by a frozen universe. Okay? Now let me explain that a little bit. This is one of my favorite demonstrations. You can do it with a superconductor. This is a high-temperature superconductor, but it doesn't matter. If you take a superconducting little piece of metal and you put a magnet over it, you know what happens? It levitates. You can levitate any magnet above a superconductor. Why? Because superconductors don't allow magnetic fields inside them. So the magnet goes on top of it, but the magnetic fields get repelled so strongly, because the superconductor won't allow any magnetic field inside of it, that it basically forces the magnet to levitate. It can't get close. Okay? It's a wonderful little demonstration. That's an interesting property of superconductivity. It tells us something. Because we understand that what happens is, the reason you can see me and I can see light from distant stars is because light is massless. Right? That's incredibly important. It's also the reason electromagnetism is a long-range force. Photons, the particles that convey light from my eye to your eye and from the lights from here to there, is because the photon is massless. Okay? Now, in a superconductor, what happens is, because of the fact that charges can flow freely without any resistance, it turns out that photons, electromagnetic fields, when they try and enter the superconductor, the electrons basically can shield any electromagnetic field by moving appropriately. And what it means is, inside the superconductor, the photon isn't massless anymore. It's massive. It acts like it's massive when it's inside the superconductor. It is massive. That's why it can't get in. That's why it's repelled. Photons, because they suddenly get massive, can't make it through the superconductor. Okay? They can only make it from stars to here because they're massless. If they were massive, they would never be able to make it. You can show the forces would die off exponentially. Exactly as they do in a superconductor, the electromagnetic forces die off on the surface of the superconductor, and inside there are no electromagnetic forces from the outside. They're the perfect shields. Now that is an interesting idea, and it was realized in a long story, which is a fascinating one, and I would argue one of the greatest intellectual adventures that humans have ever been on, that this actually applies to the universe in which we live. Electromagnetism is a long-range force because the photon is massless. There are other forces in nature, and particularly the weak force, which is responsible for the processes that power the sun, the processes that turn protons into neutrons, and nuclear fission and nuclear fusion. So the process that's really responsible for our life in some ways, it only operates on the size of a nucleus. Okay? Physicists for a long time tried to understand forces other than electromagnetism, which is the first force we understood as a quantum theory. Feynman and others helped us understand it. We tried to understand the weak force, another force called the strong force, but particularly the weak force, and it operates only on the size of a nucleus. Well, when we tried to make the theories of it turns out that we could make that work if the particles that convey that force were massive. You could make it work. The problem is the theory doesn't make sense. If you have a force law that looks just like electromagnetism, but you put in massive particles and you make it a quantum mechanical theory, you get infinities. The whole thing breaks down. It doesn't make sense. And physicists for a long time couldn't figure out what the problem was. And then one guy, or a few people, realized, hey, here's an interesting example. What happens in a superconductor is electrons bind with other electrons, believe it or not, and condense in something called a Bose condensate. That means all the electrons act as one quantum coherent quantum thing. And that's why there's no resistance, because when individual electrons are moving through a conductor, they bounce off nuclei and they dissipate energy. But when all the electrons are a coherent quantum state, they can't bounce off anything. Because for the whole thing to bounce off something would take so much energy, when the system is cold, it can't happen. So the whole thing moves around without bouncing off anything. And in a superconductor, a current will flow forever without a battery. For that reason, pretty neat, yeah. Discovered in 1911, explained by some remarkable physicists, John Bardeen and others in 1957. Who's heard of John Bardeen? None of you. It's just so disgusting because, no, okay, some of you have, of course, but you don't count. No, but because he won 2 Nobel Prizes. Okay, he explains superconductivity. He also invented something called the transistor, which has affected your life, okay? But many of you know who that football player was in that thing. But it's Bardeen some amazing stuff, okay? But that explanation was an amazing explanation of how superconductors work. But physicists realized that may describe the universe we live in. We may live in a superconductor, essentially a frozen icicle. Because if not a Bose condensate of electrons, if there was some field that condensed into empty space everywhere in the universe, like a Bose-Einstein condensate in a superconductor, if that somehow existed throughout all of space, but that field only interacted with the particles that convey the weak force, then it could be that the particles that convey the weak force are actually massless. They don't have any mass, just like photons. The theory of the weak force is identical to the theory of the electromagnetic force. But when that condensate forms, suddenly the particles that convey the weak force interact with that condensate and act like they're massive, just like the photons do in a superconductor. And in that universe, the weak force will suddenly become short range, just like photons can't die off very quickly in a superconductor. The people who suggest that were a number of people. One of them was named Peter Higgs. We call that field the Higgs field. Okay? And that was proposed in 1964 65. And we spent 40 years trying to build a machine that would discover whether that's true, because it's a beautiful idea. It's a beautiful idea, but science, unlike religion, is not about beautiful ideas. Well, religion isn't even about beautiful ideas. It doesn't just tell stories, it makes predictions. So explaining something after the fact is no good. It's really neat, but we had to see if what really counts is whether it is empirically testable. And interestingly enough, the great thing about quantum mechanics is that it's sort of sadomasochistic, okay, or with quantum field theory. If you have a field in space, it's associated with particles. And if you spank the vacuum hard enough, I like that, I'll say that again. If you spank the vacuum hard enough, you'll actually kick out real particles. And those particles are called Higgs particles. So for 50 years we said, we want to build a machine that will spank empty space hard enough, where we take enough energy from and put it in a small enough region that maybe we can excite real particles, and if that Higgs field really exists, then those particles should exist. And as you know, on July 4th, 2012, we discovered the Higgs particles. We discovered we live in this world that's an illusion. That the only reason you and I exist are because of it. Because once the Higgs field gets mass, it turns out, once the particles that convey the weak force get mass, so do many of the particles that make you and I up. We think much of the mass of all elementary particles is due to interacting with that Bose condensate that exists throughout all of empty space. If it wasn't there, all the particles that make us up would be massless. Our existence is an accident. We are like those that live on that icicle. The world that we live in which we exist in, the world that some people claim was created for us, is just an accident and an illusion. In the underlying reality, all the particles that make us up are massless, the particles that convey the weak force are massless, and it's all there just because the universe happened to freeze in a certain random direction and cause that Higgs field to form, just like in certain materials, and only certain materials, if they get cold enough, it'll freeze and form a Bose-Einstein condensate. And those other materials are not superconducting. If the universe hadn't frozen randomly in that specific direction, just like that icicle, we wouldn't be here. So much for a universe created for us. It's just an accident, like living on an icicle. And just like those people who live on an icicle, if they did, would create a theology explaining why it was so beautiful and purposeful that the universe was created so that they could exist, they wouldn't know that in another icicle, somewhere else, the other direction would be pointing and would be specially favored, and their universe would be very different. It's a cosmic accident. I'm in Canada, I had to show beer bottles, but if it's just like what happens. Our universe, it turns out, is just like we think what happens if you have a party, a beer party, which all Canadians have and will have later maybe. But if you're like me, you forget to put the beer bottles in the fridge before the party. So what you do is you put them in the freezer. And then you forget. And then the next day you open one up and it cracks. Because under high pressure, the liquid is a liquid, but the minute you remove the pressure, the preferred ground state, the beer suddenly freezes, the water and liquid expands, breaks the bottle, and that's what we think happened in our universe. In fact, it describes very well the history of the early universe, which led to the existence of a Higgs particle and the Higgs field. It's just like a beer party. Our universe is just like a beer party where you left the bottles in. So, in conclusion, that's how significant we all are. But the amazing thing is to try and find that out, that potentially heretical argument. We built the most amazing machine that humans have ever built, the Large Hadron Collider, 26 kilometers around. If you go to Geneva, there's the airport. You won't see it because it's under the beautiful farmland under Geneva. Here's the French-Swiss border. These particles, we accelerate protons at 99.9999% of the speed of light in that direction, protons at 99.99999% the speed of light in that direction. They collide. They go around the French-Swiss border about 1,000 times a second without passports. They just get through. You don't need it. Actually, you don't need it even above ground there. And we've created the most amazing and complex machines humans have ever built to detect these particles. This is one detector called the Atlas detector, another called the compact muon solenoid. It's a small thing. It's got the amount of iron in the Eiffel Tower in each detector. There are two halves of it. Okay, something like 30,000 tons of iron. The magnetic field is so great that they're apart before the experiment is turned on. They're not on wheels. The magnetic field is so great that we have to produce 8 Tesla, that if we turned it on when they're apart, it would drag those 20,000-ton things together. I think I have a better model in the next one, a much better model, to show you the whole thing. And we build a vacuum that's better than the vacuum in space. There are fewer particles in that 26-kilometer-long tunnel than there are in space. We have to create a vacuum that's better than we can create in space. We have to create a magnetic field bigger than anywhere else that's ever been produced on Earth. We do it with superconductors. We have 5 tons of liquid helium. The whole thing operates at 3 degrees above absolute zero. It took thousands of physicists decades to build this, and every second, the millions of collisions, in every collision has produced more information than in all the world's libraries. Terabytes of information, millions of times each second. But we did that. And we've done that and discovered the Higgs particle. And to me, as I've often said, and it wasn't due to me when I first heard this from a physicist, Vicky Weisskopf, that these accelerators are the Gothic cathedrals of the 21st century. They truly are. If you think about the Gothic cathedrals, they were built... Let's stop the applause so we can get finished. They were built over hundreds of years by thousands of artisans from dozens of countries. That's exactly what we're doing at the Large Hadron Collider. They were built to celebrate the wonder and beauty of nature, which in this case was the wonder of beauty of God. The Large Hadron Collider is built to celebrate the wonder of beauty of nature. And there's absolutely nothing wrong about replacing these with the Large Hadron Collider. It is the real beauty of nature. And we shouldn't worry about offending people for saying that understanding the real beauty of nature is much better than building beautiful structures for a stupid reason. The structures are beautiful. The reason is stupid. And we got to keep saying that for the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's okay.
Thank you. It's okay. Thank you.